Okay, so we're going to go to the second part of Pano's presentation on Maurice Foncé.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so just to recap what we did during the first hour, we saw the derivation of the Moritz-Foncé formalism and a few general properties that come without making approximations, but just making some assumptions about the form of the projection and the type of variables that we focus on. So, however, we talked about an approximation which was a short time approximation, which can turn into a short memory approximation if the memory kernels decay fast enough. And as we saw, there is a simplification that comes with this short memory, which we saw here, that instead of having to use the orthogonal dynamics equation, you use the full dynamics equation. So that thing that I mentioned initially about having to solve this PDE in a huge dimensional space goes away. So the short memory case, while it is easier to deal with, is not the prevalent one in real-world applications. That's the problem. If everything was short memory, then we wouldn't be having this summer school probably. So, but since you don't have this short memory, meaning short memory means that there are some slow variables that you focus on and there are some fast variables that you try to eliminate. One way that you can think about it is that you can try to develop methods which identify slow resolved and fast unresolved variables, and then you can construct a reduced model for the slow ones, which is going to be a short memory model. Okay, so this is, I can tell you from now, this is like the holy grail. I mean, how to construct from an arbitrary system, how to identify what are slow variables and what are fast variables. However, there are also some practical limitations to this. Not only it is difficult, but as I write here, it is easier said than done because the slow variables should also have some physical significance. And I'll explain what I mean by that. This is not obvious if the slow variables turn out to be highly nonlinear combinations of the underlying variables. About, I don't remember now exactly, 5 or 6 years ago, I received a preprint from someone who said we have solved the problem. And the thing was that indeed they found a way of identifying slow variables for an arbitrary system. But there was a catch to it, that these slow variables basically had no physical significance. There were these very complicated nonlinear functionals of the solution for which, yes, indeed, you could get equations which had a short memory. However, you could extract no information from it. I mean, even if you constructed the reduced model for these complicated nonlinear functionals, there was no way from that to infer anything about the original system and how it evolved. So yes, even if you can construct sometimes things that are slow variables and you can construct short memory models for them, it's not necessarily the end of all your trouble. You have to have this constraint that the slow variables must also have some physical significance. So if someone asks you a question about the system, you can answer, all right? So if we go further from the short memory case to the intermediate memory length, now of course all these things are deliberately vague because I will not, no one will hold it against you and ask you how many units does the memory have to be to qualify as intermediate and not short, okay? So, but let's assume that whatever you understand by intermediate memory length, that it goes for several units of time, but not forever, okay? So for intermediate memory length, the necessary memory kernels can be found through a Volterra integral equation formulation, which you can get starting from Dyson's formula. And you saw some things about that. Maybe, I don't know if you will see more in, probably Eric is not going to talk about this. But the important thing is the following, that again, when you don't have the short memory approximation, so you cannot get away with e to the SL instead of the e to the SQL, for the intermediate memory length, you can still get away without solving the full orthogonal dynamics equation. Instead, what you do is that you only solve for certain correlations of the solution. So that's very different. Okay? So instead of getting the full orthogonal dynamics equation, you get only certain correlations of the orthogonal dynamics equation solution. So this is what you do here with this Volterra integral equation, and I don't want to go into more details. You can look at the work of Chorin, Howden, Kupferman, and of course Eric and George, who have developed. I mean, I think George this morning talked about how to construct Markovian approximations for non-Markovian memory, right? Was that the case? I think so. So this you can look there. But now we will go and push things even more, okay? So intermediate memory length may not be enough, okay? So there are real-world applications where the memory is really, really very long, okay? But it's long not in a trivial way. It's not just a constant thing that will not move, so you only need to know, very little about it. But you have things that are unresolved variables which evolve at time scales which are comparable to the scales that you have, and at the same time there are too many of them. Okay, there are too many. The unresolved variables can be too many. So that's what I write here, that the resolved variables may not only evolve on time scales which are comparable with those of the unresolved, but the unresolved variables could be too many to even run the full system once. Okay, and as I said, this may appear now to be like a problem that we just set up for ourselves, but in fact many of the problems coming from materials or from molecular dynamics or from atmospheric dynamics fall in this category, that we simply don't have enough computational power to even run the full system once. Okay, so what can you do in this case? Because we still want to be able to make some predictions. So one way of addressing the situation is indeed to accept the absence of time-scale separation between the original variables and develop reduced models which are going to be based on a different classification. So remember when I presented the time-scale classification, I said that there's going to be a second classification of systems. This is what is going to be now. So usually when people present reduction formalisms, they stick with the time-scale classification. They say, I have the slow variables, I have the fast variables, or I have the variables that are the other way around, or there is an absence of time-scale separation. But there is a second classification of systems, which is, if you think about it, as you will see now in the next slide, it is very interesting because it is based not on the time scales, but on the actual size of the system, meaning the cardinality, meaning the number of active length and or time scales. Because you can have problems where this size is simply too large, okay? Now, this classification will help us actually to identify new small quantities for which we can formulate perturbation expansions. One thing that, if you look enough and for a long time at the literature in model reduction, you will see a lot of perturbation expansions, okay? Which makes sense in certain contexts. I mean, even for the case when you have slow, fast variables, you do have some kind of perturbation expansion where the small parameter is the ratio of the time scale of the fast variables divided by the time scale of the slow variables. If that is small, then you can have perturbation expansions. Well, now we will try to identify things like that, and that's what I have here. These perturbation expansions that we will do will turn out to be singular. This is the whole difficulty, that, as I said before, there is the law of conservation of trouble. If you can identify things that will make your life seemingly more easy when you deal with a very difficult problem, you will have to pay the price at some point for it. In this particular case, it turns out that we will be able to do perturbation expansions which will allow us to deal with systems which are possibly of infinite dimensionality, but these perturbation expansions are going to be singular, and thus, when you try to do things numerically, they're going to be very delicate. Okay?
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
It seems like what you're trying to design here is like some kind of closure approximation.
Yes.
But how do you know when you have enough degrees of freedom?
Yes. It's not how many degrees of freedom you have, is how many terms you need to keep.
Well, I'm thinking about this intermediate time scale. How do you know where to draw the line between the things you keep and the things you eliminate?
Oh, intermediate time scale. Wait, intermediate has to do with the memory kernel. How long is the memory?
But you could, in general, add an extra degree of freedom. I mean, where are you going to draw the line between what you consider to resolve and what you
But wait, there are two different things. You're talking about how many variables you keep and how many you. But I'm talking, when I say intermediate memory length, I'm talking about you have already chosen what variables you have, and it has to do with how long is the memory for those variables.
Okay, so it's a modeling.
So it's a different
Okay.
different thing.
So the analysis will focus.
Yes,
on
but this is going to be
That's
different.
fine.
So,
Yeah.
all right. So now for this system size classification, we're going to use three quantities, okay, which have to do with the cardinality of three different systems. First is S1 with this is the size of the original system. So imagine that you have a calculation, I don't know, a high dimensional, a high Reynolds number flow where you have that you know that, for example, you need, I don't know, 10 to the 20 Fourier modes, okay? Obviously, 10 to the 20 Fourier modes, even if you go to the largest supercomputer, you cannot even store it, okay? So let's think of this as the size of the original system. Then you have S2, which is the size of the full system. This is what is the available computational power. And then you have S3, which is the size of the reduced system. Okay? This is the size of the system for which you want to construct reduced equations. This is the size of the system that you can actually do full simulations on. That's why we call it the full system. And this is the size of the original system. And now we have to see what are the relations. The case is based on how these things are related to one another. So the first case, which is the one that we all like, is the case when the size of the full system is much larger than the size of the original system, meaning I have a lot of computational power and I can run my original system many, many times, so I can collect statistics, I can do all sorts of things. These are, for example, cases where you have linearized flows or certain chemical kinetic systems which are not very large or don't have very large time scale separations, okay? In this case, this is the nice case for which you can construct wonderful reduced models, okay? Because you can get all sorts of statistics, you can get the memory kernels accurately, and everybody's happy, okay? Now let's go to the second case, which is a marginal case, where the size of the full system, the available computational power, and the size of the original system are comparable. In this case, it may be possible to run a single simulation of the original system. That would be the case when you have large molecular dynamics calculations, where you can run one maybe long trajectory, but that's it. Okay? If I ask you to run 1,000,000 of them, you would say, no way. I mean, it took me 3 months to run this trajectory. You want now 1,000,000 of them? Okay, what? I mean, it's easy to come up with cases like that. All right, and then we go to the third case, where the size of the full system is much smaller than the size of the original system. This is the case when, even if you go to the largest available computer, it's still too small for the problem that you're trying to look at. This is the case of atmosphere-ocean dynamics. I mean, people do simulations of atmosphere and ocean coupling and dynamics, but they know that they're not well resolved, okay? I mean, it's not like you cannot do the calculation. I mean, that you can always do a calculation. The question is, how accurate is this calculation? So people have these global circulation models, and now they also put in the oceanic dynamics, they put chemistry, they try, and these things, as the computer power becomes stronger and stronger, more and more computer power, they get better and better results. But still they know that they're far away from what we would call a well-resolved calculation. Similarly, you could have problems with fluid structure interaction, okay? And the problem that brought me into this business in the first place was tracking singularities of partial differential equations, okay? This is like the ultimate problem when it comes to model reduction, because you have, if you have a singular PDE, it means that you have a PDE, the partial differential equation, whose solution develops a singularity, which means that it develops activity down to the 0 scale, which means that you need an infinite number of modes or scales or whatever you want to call it. You need infinite resolution in principle, okay? So the question is there something that we can do starting from the Moritz-Wanzig formalism and deal with cases like that? Okay. Now, I have to say that for this case, for example, Eric has done a lot of great work, and I will have the reference to that work in the end, where of how to extract a lot of information when you only have access to one long trajectory, for example, from molecular dynamics, and how to construct. You constructed also Markovian dynamics, right? For the for the based on on the statistics extracted from long trajectories.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is a really very nice work. So I will have the reference in the end. Okay. So the first thing that we can try to do is, when we try to look at this problem, is to say, okay, I have this problem, there is absence of time scale separation. What is the simplest thing that I can do? Okay, I mean, I know that it's not going to be probably very accurate, but at least what is the simplest thing that I can try to do, put in my computer? So again, let's go back to the memory, because this is the whole difficulty, right, of the reduction formalism. So if we look at the memory term, as I have said again before, there are two evolution operators. There is the full dynamics operator, e to the TL, and there is the orthogonal dynamics operator, e to the TQL. And as I have already said, the full dynamics operator evolves on a time scale, let's call it tau f, and the orthogonal dynamics operator evolves on another time scale, let's call it tau o, and there are three major cases. Either, which we have already talked about, there was the tau f much greater than tau 0, tau f comparable to tau 0, which is the one we're going to look at now, and tau f much less than tau 0. Now, if we want to assume that we have the case of absence of time scale separation, what could be the simplest approximation that we can think of? We have two evolution operators, okay, e to the TL and e to the TQL, and they evolve on similar time scales, okay? So the simplest possible approximation is that if we assume, and that's why I have this if, this is very important, it's an assumption, that's why I have it in red. If we assume that both of these operators are analytic, and that's again an assumption here, okay, that's why it's in red, then we can expand the expression here, this thing, in Taylor series around s is equal to 0, and if we assume that these things evolve on comparable timescales, the simplest approximation I can have is if I keep only the 0 order term from each one of the two expansions, okay? Which means that these things I assume that they evolve on comparable timescales, so the simplest thing that I can do is if I keep only the 0 order term from both, okay? So I have two Taylor expansions, one for this, and keep only the 0 order term. So, oops, there is a, here, sorry about that. Here there should be an equal sign. Okay, so this is the memory term, but it stops here, okay? All right, so no, it's actually equal because I have the error here. So it is equal to t e to the TL, PL, QL, U0, K, and you can show with similar arguments like the ones we saw before, so I don't do it again, that this is an order t squared calculation. And because it has this explicit dependence on t, that's why we called it the t model, okay? Now, it's very easy to see how you get it if you do just the zero approximation of this operator and the zero order approximation of this. You're left with e to the TL, and then PLQL, and then there is nothing left in the integral, so from 0 to t it gives you this factor of t. That's all of how you derive it, okay? So now that we have this very simple approximation, the moment you have it, well, actually after you get some results and you're happy about it, then you start having all sorts of questions about where does this thing go, okay? So, first of all, let's see the following, that this T model, as you see from here, it contains no adjustable parameters. When you model things and you see that you have an approximation which contains no adjustable parameters, that's a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. It's a good thing because, oh, look, we have no adjustable parameters, so this thing can possibly work for all sorts of situations. On the other hand, it's bad because you say, oh no, no adjustable parameters, so what if I want to make it fit certain data? What then? How can I guarantee that? So these points, I mean, what I'm telling you now took us years in order to understand all these things. So this points to that the T model cannot be the final answer, right? I mean, as you expect, there has to be something that goes beyond the T model. So then comes the question, okay, you do this approximation, but is it stable? Is it convergent? Well, we have applied it to all sorts of PDEs, okay, and to Hamiltonian systems, and you can prove that if the solution of the original system is smooth, then the T model is not only stable, but is also convergent, okay? So as a model, it's nice because the moment it is stable, at least it's guaranteed not to blow up, okay? And if you have the original system having a smooth solution, then you can also prove convergence. And in particular, this convergence has been proven, well, for the Berger's equation, while the solution is smooth, for nonlinear Schrödinger equations, for the KdV equation, for the Euler equation, for the Navier-Stokes equations, and for Hamiltonian systems in general, okay? So it has been done for all sorts of things. As you saw, some of these equations are known to have singularities there because that's what I was interested in. So then the question is, can it be used to address this case? The case that I mentioned before, where the size of the original system is much larger than the size of the full system. So can it be used to track singularities? And of course, the next question is, what about the higher order terms? Okay, you said, let me do a Taylor expansion and I keep only the zero order term. But I don't like that. I want to know what happens to the higher order terms. Here is exactly what I write. A sea of instabilities, okay? What this means, this translates into about maybe 4 years of work on and off, where I tried to get the higher order terms and nothing would work, okay? It kept blowing up. So then the question is, all right, is there any way to find, you know, any safe harbor in this sea of instability? So what can be done? And that's where renormalization will come in and save the day, okay? Like it saved the day in high energy physics, because people there had the analog of what I was finding, which were blow-ups for the numerical models. There they would do calculations, and the moment they tried to go to a higher order term, they would get infinities, infinities, infinities. And they couldn't understand what was going on. It turns out that there is a common thread between what they had and what I was having. So, and renormalization cures the problem. So let's start with some examples first to see whether the T model is any good, and then we will see how to go beyond that. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Berger's equation. The Berger's equation is a very simple first one-dimensional nonlinear equation. Here I have it, Vt plus, this is a bilinear form, which is, if you have Vv, that's 1/2 v squared derivative with respect to x. So equal to 0 would be the 1D Berger's equation. These extra terms here, you don't have to care about the details now. This is the T model, okay? So the Berger's equation, whether maybe you know about it, maybe you don't, you can prove that for almost any initial condition which has a compact support, it will develop shocks. What does this mean? It means that there will be some point in the domain, okay, where there's going to be a discontinuity. The solution on the left and the right, as they approach this point, will not match, okay? And this has the property that once a shock forms, it doesn't go away. What a shock does is that it likes to eat energy. So you can solve the 1D Berger's equation with the method of characteristics up to the point where you have the shock formation, and then you see that what happens later after that is that you have the shock where it forms and then it moves, and then you have characteristics from the left and right moving into the shock. That's why once the shock forms, the solution is no longer time invertible. Okay, so shock formation is a dramatic effect, okay, for the PDE. The nice thing about Berger's is that even though a shock forms, and there is no classical solution anymore for the PDE, you can define weak solutions, which are the shocks, okay? But these weak solutions will dissipate energy, okay? And where does this energy go? It goes into the shock. If you want to think about it, how does it work? If you like thinking in terms of Fourier modes, which helps in this case, is that you have a cascade of energy from the large scales down to the small scales, and until you reach, the 0 scale, and then the energy gets out of the system, escapes from the system. That's the character of the weak solution, which is the shock. Now, another equation, which so the 1D Berger's equation, maybe you know that it was used as a very simple model, as a 1D model. That was the original motivation for fluid mechanics, okay? Of course, it turns out to be a very, very simple model, but at the same time, it has become a standard problem when people try to look at shocks. Now, another problem, which is much more useful for applications, in particular it has to do with lasers, is the focusing nonlinear Schrödinger equation. So the focusing nonlinear Schrödinger equation is a Schrödinger equation. Well, that's the Schrödinger part here, but it is nonlinear because it has also a nonlinearity, and focusing is because there is a defocusing one. So the focusing has the property that if you start with an initial condition whose L2 norm is larger than the ground state energy, than the ground state mass, then the solution will blow up, okay? In terms of applications, that would mean that you will have a concentration of a laser to something, or a laser guide, or things like that. So people are interested in how this thing forms, this singularity, and what happens afterwards. And unlike the Berger's equation, there is very little theoretical work as to what happens after a blow-up, after the blow-up for the nonlinear Schrödinger equation. Now, as I said, these problems, they seem to be more of academic interest in the sense that we're looking at singularities of PDEs. However, the results that that I will show you, which have to do with the breakdown of the Moritz-Wanzig formalism, I can tell you now that in preliminary work that we have with a PhD student at the University of Washington, we have seen that the Moritz-Wanzig formalism can break down not only when you have a singularity forming in the system, but also in cases where the original system, in cases like that, in cases like this, you don't need to have a singularity forming. The formalism can break down if you have a system whose original size is larger than the full system that you can afford. Okay? In fact, in particular, the results that we have are for the KdV equation, which is known not to develop any singularities. But if you start to construct through Moritz-Wanzig formalism a reduced model, and you start with a resolution which is not enough for the full resolution of the solution, the Moritz-Wanzig reduced models can blow up. Okay, so what you will see here, even though you will see it in, let's say, the idealized realm of singular PDEs, they have applications also in things that are not necessarily singular. So let's see how the T model behaves actually, because okay, this is what it looks like for these equations, but let's see, and these, let's see now the results both for Berger's and for nonlinear Schrödinger, and then we will try to explain what's going on. So if you look at the inviscid Berger's equation, which is what we have, and you start with an initial condition which is the sine of x, then it's easy to prove that at time t equals 1, there will be a shock forming, okay, at the middle of the domain. It's a standing shock, and all it does is that it attracts characteristics and it starts eating up the characteristics. So if you look at the energy, by energy here, I mean the square of the L2 norm, okay? If you look here at the log-log plot of the evolution of the energy with time, because it's a logarithm, time 0 corresponds to time 1 in the linear scale, so you see that the energy is constant until time 1, and then it starts decaying monotonically here, okay? And this thing will not stop, this decay, until it has, for infinite time, consumed all the energy of the initial condition, okay? That's how a shock, it's a very simple case of a shock. So, because this is a simple enough initial condition, and here I'm looking at the case of periodic boundary conditions, you can actually prove this. You can find, for example, if you're interested in the proof, you can find it in this very nice SciAm conference series of Peter Lacks has a short book which is about conservation laws, and he has the proof there that if you look at the Berger's equation with periodic boundary conditions, then after the formation of the shocks, eventually, there will be a decay of the energy which will go as t to the -2, okay? So what we have here is that if we apply the T model, which I remind you has no adjustable parameter, okay, and I apply it with just 32 Fourier modes, okay? Imagine we're talking about a system that develops a singularity, which means that potentially it needs infinite number of Fourier modes, okay? You evolve this T model with 32 modes, and after the formation of the shock, before it does not dissipate any energy, after the formation of the shock, it starts dissipating energy, and it does so with a slope which is very close to the theoretical value. So instead of -2, it goes to -1.97. So, and that's without any adjustable parameter. So the first time we saw that, I mean, we couldn't believe. We said, what is going on? I mean, without any adjustable parameters, this thing worked like a miracle, okay? And
how does the solution look in the physical domain? Like
it has the Gibbs oscillation because it's Fourier modes, but it captures sharply the shock.
Yeah.
So, but you cannot avoid the Gibbs phenomenon unless you go and do some post-processing. But it's remarkable that it gets sharply the shock at the location and the discontinuity too. So, and then we left the, I mean, in the meantime, here I'm between this and this, there are about 3 years. Okay, so in these 3 years, I applied it also to the Euler equations in 2D and 3D and the Navier-Stokes equations. But since no one knows exactly what happens for these equations, I'm not going to show you any results, but I'll show you what happens for the case of the critical nonlinear Schrödinger equation, where we do have some idea about what is happening. And this nonlinear Schrödinger equation is a very different creature from Berger's. The solution for that one, as I said, if you have enough mass initially, will blow up, but it will do so in a completely different way. So if we look again, mass now again is the logarithm, mass is the L2 norm in the terminology of Schrödinger equation. And if you look at the evolution of the mass with time, what you find is that this purple line here is the estimated blow up time, okay, when the singularity happens. You find that if you run the T model with an increasing number of modes, 16 is this one, 32, 64, 128, 256, where is it? It's somewhere in here. Cannot see it, it's somewhere in here. And then 512, finally. You see that as you increase the number of modes, there is a sharpening of this transition around the blow-up time. And in fact, you see that you converge to this kind of step function for the behavior of the mass, which means that the mass is constant, and then there is an instantaneous ejection of mass, and then again the mass remains constant. And in fact, if you start with an even larger mass, you can have several of these steps. Okay, so this was a result that when I got numerically, I've never seen any PDE behaving like that before. In fact, I said, okay, it must be something. I mean, it cannot be just a fluke. But I've never seen any PDE, any other PDE behaving like that. So, and a few months after that, I just happened to come across a paper by Terry Tao, where he constructed qualitatively, he said, what should the solution look like for the critical Schrödinger equation when after the discontinuity happens? And he came up with this thing that if there is a blow-up in the Schrödinger equation, it must follow this pattern. It has to be instantaneous. There is no gradual energy decay like in the case of a shock. So it's as if the system, if it has enough mass initially, it starts accumulating this mass at one point until it reaches a singularity, it ejects this mass instantaneously, and then it continues, I mean, it gets it out of its system, and then it continues again with a constant mass, and maybe if it has enough mass, it will do the same thing again later. But there can only be a finite number of such masses until you reach a small enough mass that no longer happens any need for a singularity. Okay? So again, this was computed with the T model with no adjustable parameters, and again, I was very happy about that. So then I said, all right, I'm very happy about these things, but I want to find out what happens to the higher order terms. Why do I get these results which look very nice? There has to be an explanation why the higher order terms do not matter here, okay? Because if I get the results which are so accurate with just this term, there has to be an explanation why I don't need the rest of the terms, okay? Okay, so this started a period of time where there was a lot of frustration, because anything I tried, I mean, I would go back to this problem maybe for a few months, then I would leave it for another few months, because anything I tried would blow up. Any higher order terms I would try would blow up. However, what I observed after some time was that they were blowing up, but they were blowing up close to when the singularity happens. So all these higher order models that I had could never cross the time of the singularity. So long before the singularity it would be fine, and then as you approach the singularity it was never able to cross the singularity. So that meant that there was something happening there as you approach the singularity which made the higher order terms kick violently, okay, and take over the solution. So the T model, which as we have said was stable, could not tame them. Okay, so there's something happening with these higher order terms. And I realized after a lot of work that what was happening was what I said before to pay attention to these red letters here. All the assumptions, all the derivation of the higher order terms was based on the assumption that these operators are analytic. So I can actually do the Taylor expansions. But it turns out that when you have things like singularity happenings, like things like singularities happening, or when you are, in this case, where your original system is much larger than the full system that you can afford, there may come a time in your calculation when this approximation here, no matter what you do, they break down. Which means what? That the full system which you use to compute the memory kernels and the noise and everything is no longer enough to resolve the solution. So if you apply the Moritz-Wanzig formalism as it is, it's not enough. You need to add something to it which will stabilize things and hopefully stabilize them and keep the accuracy. Okay? So that's exactly what at some point I thought I did, and I'll tell you why it failed. All right? So after playing around with all sorts of reformulations of the memory term, I tried to identify where is the source of this instability and whether I can do something with it. So you can start with Dyson's formula, and you can use the linearity of the memory term. So you can of e to the TL, and the memory term can be rewritten in this form. So all I have done here is take Dyson's formula, okay, bring the two terms, the e to the TL QL and the e to the TQL QL UK to the same, take out e to the TL, so there is an e to the minus TL coming out here. That's all I've done, nothing else here, okay? And now I employ the identity P plus Q and the usual Baker-Campbell-Hausdorff series for this, because here I have two evolution operators, okay, and I would like to combine them. But as you know very well, if this operator and this operator do not commute, you don't get just a simple cancellation, so that you would get e to the minus TPL, but you get the Baker-Campbell-Hausdorff series. So this thing here, this quantity here, can be written as e to the C, T and U0, which is given by this, the BCH series, okay? Why was this nice? This was nice because it showed me the following thing, that I would like ideally to keep this term only. Why would I like to keep this term? Because if I keep e to the minus TPL, then I can expand it and I will get terms that have projections. So I get a closed system for the reduced model. So what would be the thing that would control whether I can keep this thing or not? This commutator here. So the problem of making this approximation for the memory, for the higher order models, boiled down to the magnitude of this commutator. And this commutator also Eric has found in his discrete formulation of Moritz-Wanzig, that there is this commutator which has to do between the projected dynamics and the orthogonal dynamics, and that this thing controls basically what happens with the memory there. In fact, it's very easy to show that if this thing is identically 0, then there is no memory. Okay, the memory drops out completely. It's not that you get a short memory, the memory drops out completely. However, if you recall what I said, life is not so simple. If this thing is not 0, and even if it is small enough, because you have no longer, you have a singular perturbation problem, so even if this quantity is small, if it's not 0, it can get you into a lot of trouble. Okay, so that's what I tried to do. I came up with an expansion. That's all the things that I said now in words. So this approximation here by e to the minus TPL is controlled by this commutator, and the approximation is of order t cubed. So depending on the initial conditions, PLQL may be small, and thus allow the simplification of the memory term expression. So that's what I did. If you make this approximation and you can expand this operator, and you get this very nice expansion, and I was very happy, I can tell you. I remember it was 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, I was very happy about this. I said, great, I have finally found a way that depends on a small parameter that if I control, I make sure that this thing will behave nicely. I can get a higher order models and they will behave nicely. Yes, well, the remark says here that this approximation turns out to be unstable. Okay? And the reason why it turns out to be unstable is that even if you have an initial condition for which this commutator is small, as you approach the singularity, this commutator does not have to remain small. Okay? However, the fact that you can have this commutator being small brings us, and let me show you what, before I show you exactly what you can do about it, let me show you what I mean by instability. That if you look back at the solution that we had before for 1D Berger's equation, so here, the green here is the exact solution for the evolution of the energy. The red is the Moritz-Wanzig model of third order, okay? And that's what I meant that the thing blows up. At time 1, as I said, you have the formation of the shock. The energy cannot cross, this reduced system cannot cross the time of the singularity, it blows up. And then we have this black line here, which is the same order model from Moritz-Wanzig, but it has this small r in front. This small r stands for renormalized. So all this work that I have been explaining now in the second hour leads to the following thing. That yes, the instabilities are there, and the instabilities should be there, because the Moritz-Wanzig formalism, when you try to deal with cases like that, it's not enough. Okay, you have to do something more about it. And it turns out that yes, what you can do is what is called renormalize the expansion. Now, renormalization is a word that it has been used and misused, and it's actually a very old concept. So renormalization is the following, in a very simple way, that you start with a model and you say, okay, this model can give me something, all right? But what you can do is you can say that if my model depends on some kind of a parameter, okay, can I adjust, if I see that my model for the original values of the parameters gives me infinities, can I adjust these parameters so that they reproduce maybe certain experimental data that I have, results, experimental results, and if they do that, hopefully the infinities will go away, will cancel. So that was the original motivation when it was developed in high energy physics, but in fact, one of the first, since I can give you a very simple example of renormalization, even though no one called it like that, was around 1840 when George Stokes was, he was studying theoretically the movement of a sphere in a fluid, okay? And he said that, okay, I know that I have a sphere moving in a fluid. Obviously, I don't know how the fluid, I don't have control over the whole fluid, right? I don't, he knew he didn't need the computer to understand that he doesn't know how the fluid moves. But he had this brilliant idea which said, what if in Newton's equation, when I write it down, I can replace all the effect of this fluid that I don't know by changing the mass of the particle. Okay? So he said that the effect of the fluid on the particle is just a new value for the mass of the particle. This addition of the mass, which is basically the content of all later what turned out to be renormalization, which means that if you have what I said before, if you have some parameter in your system, you can adjust it in order for it to reproduce experimental data. In the case of Moritz-Wanzig reduced models, this works as follows. Instead of keeping the original Moritz-Wanzig reduced models, you embed them in a larger class of reduced models, which have the same functional form, but have different coefficients in front of the various memory terms. Okay, and here is the thing that makes things difficult. We are talking about systems which develop these singularities dynamically in time. So if you want to estimate these coefficients, this you will have to do on the fly as the system evolves. That's how, whether you were going to do it from data or whether you will have a full system calculation running, which will allow you to calculate them on the fly, it doesn't matter. The thing is that these coefficients need to be estimated on the fly, and that is why this is not just a simple renormalization, but is a time-dependent renormalization. So if you are familiar with renormalization from high-energy physics, you know that there it is time-independent. Here it is actually time-dependent. And so what this translates is that for the memory, instead of having this expansion here in front of each one of the memory terms, I go and put a coefficient which is going to be computed on the fly. Now, the very nice thing that comes from the Moritz-Wanzig formalism, I mentioned before that the memory terms are dictated by the formalism itself. This is a very nice property of the formalism. A second very nice property is that the renormalized coefficients are dimensionless by construction. If you have done any kind of perturbation theory, you will know that one of the things that you have to do and be careful is how to identify the dimensionless quantities in which you need to do the perturbation so that you don't have strange dependencies on units of time and things like that. The nice thing about this formalism is that these coefficients are dimensionless by construction, okay? And so finally, since we don't have much time, I can tell you that yes, indeed, this is a time-dependent problem. Finally, you can actually renormalize these coefficients, and that's how you get from the red line to the black line. That's how you tame the instability. You had to add something to the formalism. The formalism as it stood was not enough. And to find these coefficients, I used the rate of transfer of activity from resolved to unresolved scales. Remember that what we were trying to find is how does a singularity develop? And as I said, the singularity develops by having a cascade of energy or mass from the large scales to the small scales. So it makes sense when you try to compute these renormalized coefficients to try to capture this transfer of activity. And that's how we did it, and that's how it worked. So And one last thing here is that something which, if you can forget everything about renormalization if you want, but keep this in mind, okay? That the renormalized coefficients depend on the scale at which you probe the system. I mean, this is something that people who do model reduction and in general modeling understand, that the parameters that go into a system when you try to fit them depend on the scale at which you probe the system. So if I fit a problem, if I fit a model with a certain value, and I find certain values for the parameters, it doesn't mean that I can transfer this model and solve any other case. If I try to solve a larger system, I would have to find other parameters, other values of the parameters. If I try to solve a smaller system, meaning smaller length scales, I will have to find other parameters. The nice thing about the examples that I have looked at is that actually this dependence on the scale actually takes the form of scaling laws. So this is a deep property that has been used also. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept of incomplete similarity that appears in problems which come from singular perturbations. And so anyway, that's one way that you can do, and you can stabilize things, so you can address situations which fall in this category. Where is it? Here, in this category, the third one. Now, I wish I had more results from this nice PhD student, Jake Price at UW, who is working on how to apply this renormalization to problems that do not necessarily have to deal with singularities, but just for problems that fall in this category, where the original system is larger than the full system. If things go well and we have another summer school, maybe then I will report about these things. And just one more thing for the future, that yes, this is something that I mentioned before, that sometimes the holy grail would be to find a way to identify slow variables and fast variables. But I said that there is a different classification which has to do with the size of the variable, or with the size of the system. And that's what I found here, that the reason why this whole construction works was that the initial condition that I was using, where is it? Here. It's a sine of x. What does it mean? Sine of x, one Fourier mode. It's as smooth as they come, okay? So what I realized is that the reason why this renormalization, this perturbative renormalization works is exactly because I was looking at problems with smooth initial conditions. So when you have smooth initial conditions, these scaling laws depend actually on the smoothness of the initial condition. The smoother the initial condition, the smaller this higher order terms coefficient becomes, and that's how you tame the instability. So the new thing, if you want, is that not just choose variables that give you fast and slow, but choose variables for which the initial condition is smooth, okay? Because then you can apply the previous normalization arguments. Now, how do you find such variables? In fact, now with all this activity that has been going on of how to identify variables for which you can have a reduced representation of the solution, like active subspaces, compressed sensing, empirical orthogonal eigenfunction, principal component analysis, basis adaptation. If you can apply all these things to the equation to represent the solution in a system for which you have a smooth initial condition, and for these variables you can do the renormalization argument. Okay? All right, as I said, there is a connection with the concept of incomplete similarity, and finally there is a case when all these things will not work. So you can come and say, okay, what is the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is that there's no way that I cannot even find a representation that will give me a smooth initial condition. There is no way. What can I do then? Well, then we go from the perturbative renormalization to something called the non-perturbative renormalization, and let me show you just what it is, and that would be the last thing I tell you. If you look, let's take any expression here for the, I want to have somewhere the reduced, where is it? Ah, there it is. Consider the case of P, the finite rank projection, okay? This is the memory kernel. So what do you do when you do the finite rank projection? I mean, if you think about it, what do? You do a functional expansion. You have a function here, this thing, of the resolved variables, and you approximate it by this expansion, right? Yes, that's what you do, okay? In what I did in the perturbative renormalization, I used a Taylor expansion in a small quantity. But if there is no small quantity to expand, what you can do is that you can take the memory kernel, you can expand it like this, and then you can introduce coefficients to be renormalized in front of here. This is what people have been calling non-perturbative renormalization in high energy physics. There they have similar things like the memory, but there, because they were not looking at time-dependent problems, they were looking at spatially non-local problems. There they do what they call the functional expansions, and then they introduce these coefficients that then they compute and they call the renormalized coefficients. So you see, it's a very different philosophy between perturbative and non-perturbative renormalization. In perturbative renormalization, you have a small quantity in which you do a perturbative expansion. In the non-perturbative renormalization, here, you have a resolved variable function space expansion. And then you compute the, so it's a very different mentality, but different concept. But that would be, you know, the thing if nothing else works. And here are some references. I can tell you just a few words that the things that if you want to get down to the dirty details from a simple system of how this more expansive works with memory, there is this very nice paper from 2002 from Chorin, Halden, Kupferman. George gave a reference from the PNAS paper from Chorin, Halden, Kupferman from 2000, but I can tell you it's better to start from this one because this actually has examples in there that you can work out, and I can guarantee you that all the results there are correct because everything that is in there I have programmed myself as part of my PhD. So you can trust the results that are there. And the paper that I mentioned from Eric is again a PNAS paper about how to compute generalized Langevin equations and Fokker-Planck equations, and also the paper by George about how to construct dissipative particle dynamics through the Moritz-Vatrich formulation, which is a very nice paper because it explains things that people before were deriving ad hoc, and then he shows that you can actually derive them more rigorously. And the results about the nonlinear Schrödinger can be found in this paper, and the results about the renormalization, I have this nice review paper from last year, which is about renormalized, more expansive, reduced models for system without scale separation. So I think I'm done, and thank you very much.
Okay. So a lot of ground was covered.
Yeah. So sorry
Still
for
many
keeping you so late.
Still many open research questions there. Yeah, George?
Yeah.
Because I think people will get confused and
Yes.
know the answer. But, so you show the Berger's equation, and you
Yes.
show that the T model works fine,
Mhm.
the linear term. And then you add higher order terms, and it goes up. You didn't explain why the...
Yes, it works.
just the first term works.
It works, but it's not guaranteed to converge.
You show convergence. You have the slope minus 2. Everything
No,
looks
no.
like
That as you increase the resolution, that it converges. I mean, there is no guarantee. There is no guarantee. That's the problem. That's what made me upset about that. That because this thing had no adjustable parameters, and
So I'm not clear what you're saying.
Yes.
People don't get clear. So you have n equals 32 modes.
yes,
You have lots of Gibbs oscillations, but the energy was, and you expect it.
yes,
And you don't have to, like
Yes.
people said before, don't kill the oscillations. They're there to tell you something.
right,
All the wiggles have all the information. That's why you get the right answer, post-critical.
yes,
So everything is good with this case.
yes, yes, yes,
Now, for n equals 32, if you add the higher the terms,
yes,
the same thing will blow up.
yes. It will blow up. Yes.
Why?
No, it will blow up because the T-model term is probably stable. It doesn't care about singularities or not, but it's not guaranteed to be accurate. The fact that here for n equals 32 you don't need the extra terms is because you have a very smooth initial condition, and by the time you go to n equals 32, the other terms they would contribute a little bit. But if you go here, you see, my purpose was how can I use fewer resolved variables and still get the equally good result. Here I have a result with only n equals 16. It may look like a little bit going from 16 to 32, but for this case it makes a big difference as far as the values of the renormalized coefficients. If you go from n equals 16 to n equals 32, the renormalized coefficients, they drop down a lot. So in other words, for n equals 32, the T model itself turns out to be the dominant one, and the others don't contribute much. Renormalized
They
ones.
drop by half, because I remember it's 1 over n over n, basically.
It's-
1 over n.
Yeah, but they don't start. There is also a prefactor here, which was not very large to begin with.
Yeah.
So this is the T model
Drop by
term.
half.
This is the T model term, and this is not by half because it's A1 times that, so it's squared. And this is cubed.
But n equals
Yes.
32, I just want to know the answer. But n equals
Yes.
32, if you add the higher terms,
Yes.
does that blow up or not?
Yes, if you don't renormalize them, it will
Yeah.
blow up. Yes.
Although the n equals 32 with a single term, okay.
Yes, but that was exactly the problem. That was exactly the same issue that people had when they were doing in the perturbative expansion with the perturbation expansion in high energy physics. They would use the zero order term and they would get a result that looked very close to the experimental value. The moment they added the higher order terms, it would blow up.
But I think it's really, really simple, because in Taylor expansion, I give you an example which I use in my classroom. So if you have a stochastic ODE and you integrate it with Euler,
Yes.
first order, you get an answer.
Yes.
Try to use Adams-Pascal third order,
Yes.
which will be exactly the same thing. It will blow up, or you definitely get a much worse answer.
Right.
But it will blow up for the same time step.
Okay.
Why is that? Because Taylor expansion will not apply. Because the solution itself
Yes.
is not smooth.
Yes.
So you're very close to singularity.
Right.
You have a solution which is not smooth.
Yes.
And therefore, using the Taylor expansion is the wrong thing in the first place.
Yes,
That-
but
that- that's-
yes, but that's why I said, that's why it was blowing up. That's what I said, that all these things were under the assumption, and that's what breaks down. I said that all these assumptions, all these results were made for the higher order terms, assuming that there is analyticity, but the analyticity goes away. In fact, I have computed numerically the radius of convergence of the Taylor expansion, and it cannot cross the singularity. That was the thing. But that was not easy to understand why it was happening. So, well, I'll tell you what, it took...
It's obvious to me. Sorry.
Okay.
It's obvious, not because you told me that, but I kind of like, my intuition would give me that.
Yes, but then what do you do about it?
Just be also stochastic. Oh,
Yes.
don't do the Taylor expansion.
Yes,
What
but
did you do?
right, but
do something else.
right,
That's the
but
idea.
nothing works. I mean, I tried other things too. So don't think it's so simple.
No, it's not
Yeah.
simple at all.
So, and eventually you get to this thing with the
The point is that you don't throw high order terms when the solution is rough. That's because you're
What?
not going to gain. You can smooth it out with somehow. That's why we use numerics, all these tricks. That's how we can use 32 modes. I can use 16 modes for this problem. And with a numerical scheme, I can track the shock very crisply, the discontinuous alerting, and I can
Right. But you
Subcritical.
have to understand something. This thing was created for a Fourier method, not for a shock capturing method.
Sure.
That's a big difference here. I was trying to regularize a computation that was unstable. Inherently, Fourier methods do not converge after the shock. There is a very big difference. And this was not developed for Berger's. This was developed for Euler. So I was able to stabilize the calculations for Euler. The reason why I didn't show you the results for 3D Euler is because no one knows what is happening there. People know that the results blow up numerically, but no one knows what is happening. And for that, you can also apply the same technique and you can renormalize the 3D Euler equations, which you can find in another paper. So that was the thing. My purpose was not to compute for Berger's. Berger's was the standard case to try things, and then I realized that even for Berger's, trying to do it is not easy. That's the thing, that if you have a custom-made numerical solver which captures the shocks, then you don't need to go through Fourier modes. But if you have a problem for which you don't have custom-made solvers, and you have to use things like a Fourier expansion, is it possible to regularize and stabilize the calculation? That was the big thing.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think we have to wrap up the discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
Thank you very much.